Slice of Life Anime. Long ago, the 4 words you see were used in harmony to describe the most precious genre of anime in all of existence. Then everything changed when MudanTV attacked. Only the unknown Otaku, master of slice of life anime, could stop him, but when weeaboos needed him most, he vanished. 1 year passed, and he is still nowhere to be found.
I'm not dead!
Well, you are now.
Don't tase me, bro!
I don't watch a lot of AniTube, so when people link me videos, I usually watch them. Someone linked me MudanTV's Slice of Life video in my Discord channel. This is just a summary of my thoughts on it. If you want to see the main crux of my arguments, then here it is. Mudan's video summarizes my concern with the general AniTube approach to subject versus object criticism, and more broadly, content creation altogether, which includes lack of citations and sourcing,
People need to cite their shit.
cavalier approach to subject versus object criticism, and Poe's Law hitting me goddamn everywhere.
Eat shit and die.
Now to be clear, I haven't watched a lot of Mudan stuff before, so I don't know how much I should know before going in. In this case, consider my take as someone who is distant from the general meta-narrative of whatever it is he's trying to do with his channel. What does that mean? In other words, if I can't, or haven't, figured out the general thematic or paradigmic thread of his video, perhaps I'm reading him wrong this whole time. If that's the case, then feel free to correct me.
I get it. I don't get it.
Since his video is 8.5 minutes long, I will devote my thoughts to each minute time frame of his video. I haven't watched it many times, 2 or 3, but I do have some confusions and misgivings. So hopefully I explained them well enough, so let's get underway.
Sup, guys?
Go!
From the start to 1 minute, Mudan's video initially sets out its basic argument. Everybody has their own preferences, and that his specific preference is that he's never gotten to Slice of Life, and here's why. Now, he does bring up really important pieces of context, which is that he's talking about vanilla Slice of Life anime.
Don't do it. I'm a virgin.
So it'd be unfair for me to start busting out some sort of hybrid like Haruhi and expect his argument to account for that. Fair enough. Now he gets into the first argument, which is that
It's been done to death already. All the shows look the same and have the same outline.
both of these are really subjective claims, so I can't really say anything other than
I disagree.
the metrics in which people value something is going to change from person to person, and therefore what constitutes as being done to death and looking really similar will change from person to person. Using Kyo-ani and Tanaka-kun back-to-back is kind of a weird case, since they seem quite different. Not only does Tanaka-kun very clearly depend on softer, more pastel colors to mimic the languid atmosphere of the show, but Kyo-ani is also based off Toyo Sato Elementary, so the environment has an emphasis on precision. In this situation, both shows have a different aim in their environment, the very thing that Mudan seems to have an issue with. But that's not all. Mudan also notes that he has an issue with people doing the same thing, but the problem is that his examples don't match up. The first example is from High School DxD, a light novel series where a young man is trying to create a harem
I like the boobs.
and signs a pact that is interwoven with a somewhat arbitrary, yet labyrinthine system where demons and angels in various stats of undressing fights for political prowess. The second picture is directly from the daily life of high school boys trying to kill time by doing various things. The third picture is also from the daily life of high school boys. I can't find the origin of the fourth picture, and I don't have the time to keep pursuing, which is ironic considering what I'm doing now. So this is my first gripe. Not only are Mudan's choices a bit strange, but they don't actually help his claim. A battle manga with devils and angels versus a hyper-performance slapstick comedy with a bunch of boys is hardly similar.
One of these things is not like the others. One of these things doesn't belong. Can you tell which thing is not like the other by the time I finish this song?
This is even worse when you consider this. Not only are they very different with different styles, but they're not even all places from anime. The bottom left is Yasogami High, which was initially featured in Persona 4, and this specific screenshot comes from Persona 4 Arena, a fighting game. Persona 4, if you're curious, is like a Scooby-Doo-esque story, where a bunch of high schoolers solve a series of mysteries. You might argue that since it has an anime adaptation, it could fulfill the anime comment, but even then, It's not regular vanilla daily life stories like Mudan is saying. His example, in other words, works against him. Of course, people might say, "But Joe, that's just one example. What's the problem? You make those mistakes all the time." The problem is that 1, it looks like Mudan just Google image searched anime high school and just pasted examples without doing the due diligence to double check his examples. And 2, if he didn't, then his requirements of what constitutes vanilla are even more arbitrary because his examples are working against them. A few of his examples aren't vanilla in the slightest, at least in the very definition he implies. This is the problem. Of course, when you make a video and treat it with clip show editing, you don't end up caring about the examples. So anything that vaguely seems like it'd support your argument is fair game. However, from here, it just really worries me because it makes it seem really lazy. Trying to emulate mundane stuff. I, like many other people, have tried to solve a murder mystery while I visit my fiance's brother-in-law, Satan, and then go on to cross-dress in a band.
But it gets super repetitive fast.
I agree with his general argument here. Slice of life is a rather large term that is mainly useful for practical reasons. Mudan makes a good point. Slice of life could condense how we think of anime as, oh, just slice of life. The example of Mob Psycho 100 is good, but it's obviously not just slice of life, but we have particular ideas about it. This is, of course, a bit strange considering he's perfectly okay with condensing slice of life he doesn't care about in the previous minute. Now, he argues then that the reason why slice of life anime is so prevalent is that they're easy to create. So what does he mean by this? In short, 1, they're implicitly easier to create because you don't need to make any action scenes. 2, the reference material are numerous because it's real life. Or 3, you can have a scene with pretty much stills and moving lit flaps, thus saving on tons of money on animation. So these are some interesting claims, none of which he sources.
People need to cite their shit.
But they seem intuitive, right? Not necessarily. The problem here is that his argument implies animation is fundamentally studio-dependent decision. That studios or creators point at things and go, let's make a show about a slice of life because it's easier, cheaper, and etc. And not, for instance, the media mix systems that funds the productions of these shows. Simply having no action does not mean it's necessarily easier either. Look at pretty much any anime that depends on character acting to sell its premise. Kyo-ani is huge on this, particularly Yamada's work. Second, reference material are more than numerous in slice of life, but it's not just because they're slice of life by nature, but because of a vanity of stylistic and economical factors. Also, why would this preclude action series? What about the numerous action manga that have been famous Shibuya Crossing? And lastly, this implies slice of life is innately dependent on lit flaps. What I mean is that if it's easier, then why do we see shows like Nichijou, Gakugarashi, and Comic Girls, which all approach blocking, character movement, talking, the animations in different ways? Shouldn't they all just use moving lit flaps? God damn it, Joe. The problem here is one of differentiation. At what point are these arguments uniquely acceptable, if they are applicable at all, to slice of life, and not more broadly, animation in general? For instance,
My ears,
if you have seen Ava's famous, or infamous, elevator scene in a slice of life show, would you have used it as an example on how slice of life normalizes shortcuts in animation? If so, then aren't you portraying the genre rather unfairly? And if not, what differentiates them? The next thing that bothers me is that he says,
You don't have to be a genius writer to pull them off. You can just think back to your childhood and talk about things that happened to you back then, and even put a little spin on it.
this is a really offense approach to everyday stories. It immediately relegates them to being lesser simply because they're easier. That they're so much simpler to punch out because you need nothing else. In that light, if that formula worked, then you are implying that, say, the story of Norihori Yagi's Angel Densetsu and Seiyukawa's Kimi no Iumachi are of the same caliber. If you believe that they are similarly easy to write, then why haven't you written one and made a gangbuster? Why haven't just anyone? Or what differentiates them if the sameness is all that matters? To recap, it's not easier to create because there's nothing unique about slice of life creation process you demonstrated that actually is easier. And it's not easier to write because within slice of life stories there are widely divergent and different stories with types of different reputations.
It's one of the most overdone genres in all of anime, and that makes finding good shows hard.
Where are the subtitles?
So this section is roughly a Sturgeon's Law section, where Mudan argues that with more of it, you'll invariably run into more bad ones. The reasoning is fair, but again, the problem is that with Sturgeon's Law, changes from person to person, and arguably, if someone has a wider net of preference, they might end up liking more. So this discussion on good/bad, in the context of preference, is kinda a shit show. I won't bother. If you want to consider me stumped or whatever, feel free. This is a big topic that can't be covered with my limited annoyance. What Mudan does do that annoys me, however, is not cite a goddamn thing.
People need to cite their shit.
He puts up an article from the Artifest by Blawtooth the damn... Look, I don't know how to pronounce this, I'm just going to call him Blawtooth. But doesn't cite the article and doesn't contextualize it. Why? Because Blawtooth goes on to note, namely, it opens up as an opportunity to highlight the little things in life. Things that within a grander narrative may be extremely insignificant, but which are nonetheless impactful to the average everyday person experiencing them. These can narratively be both very holistic and very specific. Blawtooth then goes to describe how kyo-ani and Arya both approach environment and actions, within them in different ways. For kyo-ani, actions are pedestalized, whereas for Arya, environments are giving precision. Why? Because they're both types of everydayness. The former is a kukike, air type, and the latter is an iyashike, or healing type. Thus they end up approaching everydayness a bit differently. Blawtooth talks about that, but Mudan does not. So why does Mudan show an example of an article he never cited? Citation is usually to give credit where credit is due, and to borrow one's authoritative tone in research. Since Mudan never cited it, he's either forgetful or too lazy to do it, but was willing to borrow the tone of the article to back up his arguments, but not give credit where credit is due. I don't know, I think that's a bit much. Just give it for Christ's sake. The second point I wanted to address, I already lived a dull life. Why would I watch some 2D characters live out the same life? Let me cite my sources. There has been a difference in priority between reality and fiction. Of course, reality was superior to fiction. However, a method to juxtapose reality and fiction as functionally equivalent became generally accepted. Irony, the act of kick away the latter, or undergrounding, by assigning the whole to a part, spread. In other words, reality was made subjective through a view that reality is only what we think is real. Shinji, Miyadai, 240. Transformation of Semantics in the History of Japanese Subcultures since 1992.
People need to cite their shit.
The main takeaway here is that while Miyadai was writing in response to his manual on how to defeat the Tokyo Sarin gas attack, the idea was everydayness was originally conceived as a separation of fiction and reality. Of course, it might seem strange to think of watching a show about the everyday as odd if we think of fiction and reality as being clear distinguishing things. But Miyadai argues that we don't necessarily have to think of it in that way. We pick the parts that matter to us, and in turn, the things we discard help in shaping a particular sentiment. The idea of, why would I watch some 2D characters live out the same life, isn't that they're living out the dull parts. They're living out the good parts of that life. In an environment in which you're studying all throughout school life, and then you go on to work and work and work until you die, then the everyday type stories, or the slice of life, part of the slice of life stories, are like an album, recollecting bits and pieces. In this instance, the question Mudan poses is as strange as anyone who'd open up a photo album and say, I was already a child, why should I look at pictures of people who were children? And this is an important point to make. Sure, this isn't what Mudan got from Slice of Life, but he's talking about the nature of the story type, as if his only experience is the only way to look at it. That's the problem. He isn't considering any other vantage points on which to look at the story. The nature of the object and the role of the subject bleed together in a way that hampers any meaningful criticism. Real life always trumps anime in that aspect. He said this, but that is not what is selling. You are criticizing a bike because it's not like a scooter.
When your main selling points are the characters, and showing off their emotions and reactions, you can't really achieve the same degree as you can with film.
Not because you're a rabbit, but because you're black.
Here, he argues that film has a higher fidelity, and thus can appropriately reflect the motions and actions required for people to empathize. This is actually a rather malinformed understanding of abstraction in animation, including things like semiotics and neoteny in character design. Emphasis by differentiation, fidelity is not always superior. Animation can still invoke emotion despite having less emotion, have simpler characters, and etc. However, he does concede that it's not always a bad thing, even if I disagree with a fundamental position that is a tangible argument in the first place. He then goes and applies anime brings them things that standard television couldn't, which is a rather imperialistic argument because anime is a largely televisual medium. Mudan then goes on to say because it involves teenagers and is aimed at a lot of teenagers, he has grown out of it.
Don't touch me, motherfucker. Get out.
Not only is that a strangely insulting argument, because it implies that people who still like it haven't grown out of it, but it also implies that shows outside of their age range don't have anything else to offer someone. With that reasoning, people shouldn't be watching Dragon Ball, Akage no Annie, or Attack on Titan simply because they are shows people can grow out of. He then proposes, strangely, that it's a genre people can grow out of. Of course, it's framed in a rhetorical way, so maybe he's not necessarily proposing that, but to question it is rather odd for two reasons. One, given that he mentions earlier that slice of life interconnects with a lot of other genres, see his example on Mob Psycho 100, how slice of life should something be before its slice of lifeness means you can grow out of it? And two, wouldn't the stressful work environment of adult mean that someone should theoretically be more adept to watch it? Wouldn't watching an easy show after a hard day's work make it, I don't know, relaxing? Even assuming the fundamental premise that you can grow out of an entire genre, there are still problems with the reasonings behind how it can happen. Mudan argues that slice of life is like YouTubers, in which people do grow out of.
Anime is trash, and so am I.
So thank God that's over. I mean, it's over, right? There's not more, right? I mean...
That's fair. However, the comparison isn't really accurate. It's more a slice of life is closer to YouTube itself, in which people can grow out of, but is arguably not reasons innate to his holistic form. People find other YouTubers all the time, just like people find other slice of life shows all the time. Mudan's argument here about Orange is ultimately a phenomenological argument that isn't problematic. He likes what he likes, that is fair. The real life example is a bit reductive, considering it's literally about the very topic of a role that every day plays in an image of the past. Still, it's not really worth tackling.
But mostly, this relates to what I think is the biggest flaw in the genre, and that's the fact that it doesn't have a story or a premise.
Mudan here proposes a rather incomplete and malinformed understanding of what a story is. Stories, in Judeo-Christian storytelling, tends to have a very particular linear progression, in which someone goes from point A to point B. When we move into Buddhist storytelling, the essence of being or existing within a certain space becomes equally, or perhaps more, important than any particular forward motion. Consider, for an instance, the concept of mono no aware, or the pathos of things. The emphasis of the transcendence is itself an element of story, that this is temporary, and we must thus cherish it.
Perfectly balanced, as all things should be.
Underlines, unsurprisingly, the everyday type stories. This is particularly important in Iyashike, of which Mudan seems to be more than happy to cram together with Kukike. Now, I don't want to get into the cultural essentialism here, but it is particularly important when we consider the nature of Japan, a country beset by numerous natural disasters. At the time of this article, the country is undergoing one of its worst floods in decades, its rural towns are dying, and 75,000 evacuees are still in temporary housing about Fukushima. Stories are only linear if you believe they are. The nature of a story is nothing more than a language game. In the same vein, we moved on from thinking every single damn story is a Campbellian hero's journey, or what have you. There's a really great quote that captures this by Nathan Fielder in his great show, Nathan for You. In the episode of Smokers Aloud, Fielders cast a play that, initially, was just a loophole to use theater's law to allow smokers to smoke inside. Eventually, however, seeing how successful this play, Nathan, in Baudrillardian fashion, decided to make a play of, well, that. The owner thought it was boring, so Fielder brought in the actress, who played with the owner. She, unsurprisingly, lavished it with praise. Fielder ends his monologue with these words: "They say reality is what you make of it. So in a world that's cruel and hurtful, who says mine can't be nice?" This is a major problem I have. Mudan's arguments. He's obviously talking about his perspective on it. Sure. But his perspective presents a fundamentally flawed understanding about how a narrative behaves, and then, the process, ends up making claims about the object. It shifts from a subject's Cartesian's claim to making itself as fundamentally objective claim that, ultimately, casts aspirations, whether intended to or not, unfairly on the stories and environments in which they exist. The house metaphor doesn't work either, because stories and characters aren't so fundamentally distinct from each other that you can compartmentalize them like that. People do that in reviews because they either A, grown up to do it like that, or B, they're trying to sell something. Also, why is the story the ceiling? Shouldn't the story be the whole damn house, and the characters are the things the house consists of? I do agree that the no story argument is really poor, but not for the same reasons. It falls into the same problems of how a story must be before it can be considered a story, which is another can of worms entirely.
But I hate it! You're giving us scenery, you're giving us basic stuff that doesn't add up to anything.
Please give me huggy wuggies.
What the fuck are you saying?
It doesn't add up to anything. Once again falls back on the problems with thinking about stories as a linear device. He's free to not like them, but to make claims on the nature of the object as nothing because it doesn't fulfill your definition of linear progression isn't really useful criticism. It's interesting he mentions Proust, because Proust, and in a particular Swan's way, is about the way in both habit and action informs our memories. In this light, the meticulous actions that Proust focuses on is partially meant to act as a way for us as a reader to engage with those actions and how they recall or reflect our memories, and to actually think about how to show that in memories of characters in the novels. Christ, even Wikipedia gets it, and the problem is that Mudan sets up the idea that a story has to be thought up in this way, but that particular way is so noticeably arbitrary. However, again, it is sold as this objective way of looking at it, because the only differentiation is the subject-object language of the video. But he's talking about the nature of an object like a story. In that vein, I can say I think the Earth is flat, and that might be subjective, but people are still able to call me out, because I'm talking about the nature of the Earth as an object. This is the distinction that anti-tubers don't often make, which makes it troublesome for criticism. I can't say much about working and the ideas of watching working after work, because if you believe that they are a chosen simulacrum, per se, of experience versus reflection, then anything, including watching characters work, can itself be a form of relaxation.
Who cares? Who cares to watch the dull lives of anime characters? Well, apparently a lot of people, because they keep on making these shows. But the themes portrayed in those anime have just been done to death already. High school friendships, obligatory beach episode, onsen episodes, eating cake episode. It lacks any kind of originality.
He's already dead.
Originality is a flimsy argument in general because of two problems. One, again, if you're talking about from your perspective, but talking about the object as something to be elevated, then you're being a bit hypocritical. Originality, unless we're talking structurally in terms of movement and zeitgeist, are dependent on the subject. If I have never seen that before, then it becomes original to me. As such, people will invariably have different gauges of originality. 2. Originality isn't that valuable in some postmodern reading of text. Look no further than database reading, where people are drawn to the multitude of traits or designs or component, and as such, that particular rootness fulfills a certain watching habit. In that case, originality is secondary to fulfilling the requirements that people want in their shows. Interesting you mentioned isekai, because something a lot of people know is that this I'm is referring to Joe from Pause and Select,
people need to shit.
Reading 300 plus isekai at the same time. One of the ones I've really found interesting, but still hate, was Death March, which is an isekai that bears no originality to the context of gimmicks, implied or theatrical. But that is what an isekai very nakedly talked about, how arbitrary isekai, mainly Narukai isekai, behaved. To most, it isn't original, but that's kind of the point. It's a hodgepodge of a million isekai conventions jammed together, strung along like some sort of isekai homunculus, and passed off as, "Isn't this what you wanted?" by both emphasizing and calling to attention that, literally using the terminology Tensei and Shadoken, in the episodes, Death March could, to some people, be something they can enjoy for reasons that would kind of make sense. My sudden conclusions? Now, Mudan eventually goes back to the subjective claim that stories I'm looking forward to, but at this point in time, I've procrastinated long enough, and I hope that explained well enough why I have an issue with this kind of content. This isn't restricted to Mudan or even AniTube. However, I felt in the right mood to talk about my concerns. And even if you disagree with me, hopefully you find something I say interesting. I'm starting up a new section on my channel. At the end of my videos, I'll be showing fan art that I've gotten, such as this. This one is from Max Green Kiki, with me noticing the artist in a semi-homoerotic way. And it's the first non-commissioned fan art I've ever gotten, while also being pretty good, and I like it for that. Thanks, Max Green. The links will be in the description below. Your next fan art will be in the next video. The next one was drawn by Random Stalin. Just a quickly drawn image of me with sunglasses. Very cool. The next one on the list was drawn by George Joseph Mack. I like to call it when the edge is just right. His next fan art will be featured on the next video. The last one was submitted by Turd Flinging Monkey, which to be fair is not really fan art, but they just made it in a chibi maker. For now, I'll accept it. Thank you, TFM. Credits to everyone will be in the description below. Until next time, I bid you adieu. Thanks for watching.